The historical context part of the novel really caught my attention because, again, this novel is transcending over 250 years. So the descendants of both Essie and Effia experienced different things during different time periods. So I'll start with Effia and the main historical uh, moments within her lineage. Firstly, starting off with the transatlantic slave trade. And so I had mentioned this with Effia at the beginning, where she marries James Collins, who is the British governor. And so during 18th to 19th century Ghana, which was actually formerly known as the Gold Coast, this is where a lot of the slave trade took place and a lot of the marriages took place between the British governors and the local women. And then we also have British colonization. So after slavery was abolished, the British made Ghana a colony. And so they still had control over Ghana. And this led to many wars. One of them being the Anglo-Ashanti War, which was mentioned in the story in the part with Akua. Where, remember, I had mentioned her husband goes off into the war and her visions of fire get worse. But the war that he went to fight in was the Anglo-Ashanti War, where the people of the Ashanti state wanted to protect their land and wanted to fight for their land. And so they went to war against the British. So those were the two historical moments mentioned from Effia's lineage, which was colonization as well as the transatlantic slave trade. The historical periods mentioned in the novel also actually on the side of Essie. It starts with the American South, right? So this deals with the Americans who were enslaved in the South and were working on the plantation. And as we go through Essie's descendants, we really see the lives that they had while working as slaves and the hardships that they went through living in America as slaves in the South. And that was very unfortunate. Then we get into the Reconstructive era. So this is after slavery has been abolished, right? After the American Civil War. However, there was a time, the story mentions one of the descendants, H. He was alive during the time of the coal mining system. So after watching a few interviews with the author, she mentions this historical period in America where a lot of African Americans were arrested and sold into private companies to work in places like the railroad and coal mines, right? So slavery had ended, but there was still a way to reinstate slavery where they would arrest African American men for no reason, really, and then sell them to these companies to work. And so the character H in the novel actually is one of those individuals who was arrested and forced to work in the coal mining system. Okay? And so when he leaves the coal mining system, he's seen as a convict. But what he was able to do was a lot of the convicts from this system were able to formulate and form a coal mining system where they were ex-convicts, but they were able to go back and work for the same mining systems that they worked for as prisoners. But this time they would be workers. And so they were able to work for them. You know, the pay wasn't the best, but at least they were working as free men. And H, the character in the story, was able to form a union that really protected the rights of these ex-convicts. So that was also another part that was mentioned as well. And then there's also the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. And so we see this with the descendants of Effia as well, where some of the characters wanted to move north, right? They didn't want to stay in the South. And I believe it's Willie, who was H's daughter, didn't want to stay in the South and stay in the coal mining town. She wanted another life for herself. So she ends up moving to New York in Harlem, and her life story is during that time where a lot of African Americans migrated north for a better life. And it was also during the Harlem Renaissance where there was like this cultural growth of like jazz and poetry and different art forms that grew in Harlem from African Americans. And so that was another time period as well. And then the story wraps up with modern day America, where we see through the last two descendants of Effia and Essie, they come together, and we see how the layers, or how African and African American history is intertwined at the end, and how they come together. And so I really like that part of it, because the novel itself scopes from 250 years. We really get to see the different historical time periods and how, one period before that affected the next one. So I thought that was pretty neat.